Hi everybody, my name is Ariel and I'm the father of Yoel. Actually, Yoel was supposed to be doing this session, but he got pretty sick, so he asked me to substitute for him, which I'm doing very happily. This session is about bar and bat mitzvah. So let's get into it. First, we'll talk about the definition of what bar and bat mitzvah is. Very simply, bar mitzvah literally means son or daughter of the commandment. It refers to a person under obligation or responsible to perform the commandments, both rabbinic and biblical. It's a term denoting both the person who attains such an age, as well as to the occasion at which the status is formally assumed. So the word bar or bat mitzvah is, you could say that a person is a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, but the occasion that we celebrate their arrival to that age is also called bar or bat mitzvah. What ages are we talking about? For the boys, bar mitzvah is usually 13 plus 1 day. For the girls, bat mitzvah is usually 12 plus 1 day. Upon reaching this age, a Jewish person is obliged to do all the commandments. And as I said before, that doesn't just include the Bible, but according to the rabbis who invented this whole thing, it includes the oral Torah, the rabbinic commandments as well. Jewish law fixed considering this time to correspond to the physical maturity of both boys and girls. For boys, the physical maturity, according to their calculations, reaches about 13. For the girls, their physical maturity, according to them, is about 12. At this age, young people are brought to be able to, thought to be able to control their desires. And that's part of the whole purpose of this transition period. And this was also the time of transition from elementary school, the Beit Sefer, to Beit Midrash, the next level of public education. So that's why this age was fixed at 13 and 12. So having talked about the definition of what we're talking about what concerns bar or bat mitzvah, let's now talk about the history of bar or bat mitzvah. This is important because it's often assumed that this is a biblical practice, and it's not. As far as I know, bar and bat mitzvah are not contained at all in the Bible. Sometimes people allude to that incident in Yeshua's life when he was 12 years old and he was found talking with the sages in the temple after one Passover celebration. That was not a bar mitzvah, because bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah certainly were not practiced during that time period. What that was simply a 12-year-old talking to the rabbis. As far as any other passage is concerned, I'm not aware of any passage that can be clearly, definitively used to support bar and bat mitzvah. So as a formal practice, although the term occurs in the Talmud, which is written between 300 to 500 years after Yeshua, although the term bar mitzvah occurs in the Talmud for one who is subject to the commandments, its usage to denote the occasion of assuming religious and legal obligations does not appear before the 15th century. A special celebration for a girl, the bat mitzvah, is not even found mentioned in Judaism before the 19th century. So bar and bat mitzvah is a relatively recent practice. Let's look at some early evidence for some possibilities of its existence. While the occasion of becoming bar or bat mitzvah was formalized only in later times, it is obvious from various sources that the status of obligation for boys of 13 was assumed in earlier times. In other words, people recognized in an earlier time that there was a transition for boys from childhood to adulthood that happened about 13 years old. But the ceremony that we call bar mitzvah today was not practiced back then. According to Mishneh and Talmudic Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, 2nd century CE rabbi, a father was responsible for the deeds of his son until the age of 13. So that became an age of transition. From then on, a person can perform acts having legal implications, such as being a member of a Beit Din, being reckoned as part of a minyan, and buying and selling property. Yet there are some notable exceptions to that. So there's inconsistency at this time of history about what a 13-year-old boy can and cannot do. Rashi, who's writing in the 1000s, Rashi claims, for those of you who don't know, Rashi is considered the most famous Jewish biblical commentator. He claims that bar mitzvah was a status of obligation, was in the category of biblical laws, as it was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. There he is, he's confusing biblical laws with oral Torah. So he's equating the practice of bar mitzvah with what God taught Moses at Mount Sinai, which is oral Torah. In Judaism, midrashic literature, that is, a midrash is a rabbinic commentary on the books of Torah and the Megillot. Between, let's say, 300 to 800 or 900, a major midrash was written called Midrash Rabbah. And this was a rabbinic commentary on the books of Torah and the Megillot. And the midrash literature gives many references for 13 as their turning point in the life of a young person. For example, the Midrash says that Abraham rejected the idols of his father at this age, at the age of 13. And at the age of 13, Jacob and Esau went their separate ways. The former, Jacob went to study Torah, Esau went to do idol worshiping, according to Genesis Rabbah, part of Midrash Rabbah. Now, we had to take this with a grain of salt. Much of these wild, outlandish statements found in the Midrash were not intended to be taken literally. For example, that's all the information we have for early evidence of bar mitzvah, and we see no examples of a ceremony being called bar mitzvah. We do see that 13 seems to be singled out as an important age for boys. Now we're shifting from bar mitzvah for boys to bat mitzvah for girls. Very little is written about the transition age for girls in ancient Judaism, much less a bat mitzvah ceremony. The term bat mitzvah occurs only once in the Talmud, and it's a reference to the time a girl becomes subject to the obligations of Jewish law incumbent upon adults. But it's only mentioned once. And even so, there is difference of opinion. Was she 12 or 13 when that obligation was placed upon her? Bat mitzvah as a female ceremony, equivalent to or identical to the male bar mitzvah ceremony, is not found in Judaism until the middle of the 20th century, and is an American invention, including reading from the Torah, reading from the Torah scroll, and recitation of the Haftarah. By the first decade of the 21st century, adult bat mitzvah ceremonies had also become a common occurrence in synagogues of all denominations. That means that if you missed it when you were 13, as a lot of girls do, when you're an adult female, you could be taken through a bat mitzvah ceremony. I just want to say as an aside here, I'm not used to recording a video on the computer here, and so I don't exactly know where I'm looking. There's photo booth here, and I'm looking at the screen, the picture on the photo booth. There's also a little green dot on the computer. I'm looking at that, and once in a while I'll look up at the iPhone that's recording my voice. I just don't know where to look. So if my eyes are looking strange at you, that's why. Anyhow, back to our task. We looked at the definition of bar bat mitzvah. We looked a little bit at the history of bar and bat mitzvah. Now, let's spend some time, thirdly, looking at the purpose or purposes of bar and bat mitzvah. First on our list, it's a rite of passage. Bar and bat mitzvah is a rite of passage from childhood to young adulthood. Now, at the outset here, it should be noted that many cultures have rites of passages. They just do things differently and at different ages in different ways. It signifies the beginning of the adult journey of religious instruction. So it has purposes as a rite of passage. Second purpose is it's the beginning of the adult journey of religious instruction. A bar bat mitzvah is meant to signify the beginning of an adult's journey into the Jewish religion. We're not talking about learning about God necessarily. Hopefully that was done when the child was much younger. We're talking about learning about the Jewish religion. And it can be quite different. There are a number of religious Jews that really have a trouble believing in God. Strange as that may seem, but they're really good at practicing Judaism. Anyhow, faith and dedication are intended to grow stronger after this milestone of the Jewish person's life, and that's something to be celebrated with both family and friends. Part of the preparation is intense religious instruction. Hence, there is much learning about Judaism, both in preparing for the bar bat mitzvah and also afterwards. Thirdly, the bar bat mitzvah also serves a purpose it helps the young person, as they become an adult, to become part of the community. As you probably know, community is central to the Jewish people. The bar bat mitzvah ceremony helps to usher a young person into their congregation while binding them to their faith. So as far as the community is concerned, it helps to solidify them in their faith, to teach them about Judaism, but also it helps to solidify their place within the community. These events are a wonderful way to get together as a community, to celebrate together the marriage of a man or woman to their faith and to the community. In the Reform circles, this is often done through confirmation. Those of you from a Catholic background understand what confirmation is, which is done around the same age time, by the way. In Reform circles, they have taken that as a means of assimilating it from Christianity in their European experience and said this was practice confirmation and not bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. But that's in Reform circles, not in Orthodox circles. So, bar bat mitzvah ceremony particularly serves as a rite of passage. It serves as the beginning of their adult Jewish religious instruction journey. It helps them to solidify their part in the community. And lastly, another purpose that I could think of, and you might be able to think of some more, a last purpose that I could think of is that it shows respect to young people. It shows respect to the young people among us. This point is often not mentioned, but it is quite important. Doing a bar mitzvah helps to show respect to the young people and their abilities by not trying to make knowledge and life easy for them. Helping them to prepare for this transitional ceremony, the bar mitzvah ceremony, they had to go through rather rigorous educational training at their own expense, on their own time. Frequently, they go to public school in the day, and when they come home, a couple of times a week, they have to study with the rabbi or the cantor of the congregation. And it's pretty tough. They have to learn about Judaism, their branch of Judaism that way, by the way. And they have to learn how to read Hebrew if they're not Israeli, and how to chant their Torah portion. That stuff is not easy. And so sometimes in certain congregations, all that is skipped. We're suggesting that let's not do that. Let's show respect for our young people, that they can learn They can learn really tough educational values, really tough educational things. Let's put them through this ceremony, and let's teach them how to read from the Torah and teach them how to chant the Torah portion. So this is accomplished again by the rigorous religious training for the ceremony, as well as by the expectations for the bar mitzvah person afterwards. Let us not lower our expectations of the young people among us. They are far more capable of doing and learning things than we could ever imagine. Sometimes they really lack motivation, but that's up to us to give them some helpful and healthy motivation to do those difficult things, not shameful motivation. Let's go to point number 4 now and talk about the rituals of bar and bat mitzvah. I have some introductory thoughts about this matter. And I'd like to just say a few comments about the importance of ritual. Bar mitzvah ceremony is a ritual. And one reason why it's not practiced in a lot of circles is because in today's world, there's a lot of people, especially young people, that are raised to frown upon ritual. Just look at our religious services. What happens when we go there? We go there and we're dressed any way we want. Somebody welcomes us. We can sit any place we want. And they may say a few announcements. Maybe they'll take a collection, maybe they won't. Somebody will say a prayer. We'll get to the sermon, we'll sing a few songs, or we'll sing a few songs and get to the sermon, or maybe both. Somebody will say a prayer, and that's it. They are very, very loose. They're very non-liturgical. Whether people realize it or not, that is a liturgy in and of itself. But never mind that. That's very non-liturgical compared to, say, a Catholic church or an Episcopal church or an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. So there's a propensity against ritual in today's believing world. I like to see that changing, and there's several reasons why it should change. Ritual is important. A society's rituals reflect their values. Performing as a community ritual is a way of publicly testifying what the society values. It's equivalent to publishing a tract or a statement of belief, only you're acting it out. The things the society thinks are most important are put on public display for everybody to see. That's a ritual. Closely connected with that, we could say that rituals are great means of communication. Ritual practices in ancient times are equivalent to modern television today. They were graphic, memorable, and creative ways to teach the members of the community what their values and beliefs were and are. And that could still hold true today, especially today when many societies are more geared to visual stimulation than they are to oral stimulation. Ritual falls under the visual category. Rituals can help a group of people see and hear not just the community's values, but also the community's beliefs in a very graphic and visible way. Rituals, thirdly, also provide for group participation in both the educational and propagational process. Rituals are multifaceted. I'll say it right this time. Rituals are multifaceted and sometimes quite complex. They sometimes require many people to participate and to make them happen. This provides outlets for those in the community who find it difficult to find their place in the society. They can participate in the rituals and help make them happen. And in doing so, they are participating in the educational ministry of that community. They're participating in a great hands-on way. They become the teachers, even though they would shun standing in front of the classroom and lecturing. but they would like to just do the rituals and do what they're taught to help communicate the truth in a visible way. Fourthly, the role of ritual is in preserving heritage, memory, and identity. This is kind of similar to what we've said already, but I want to emphasize this aspect of it. Rituals help to preserve heritage, memory, and identity. The value and need for preserving these things while updating the culture and heritage from where we come from, it adds more impetus to celebrate and participate and do these rituals. Do we value our heritage? Do we value the society memories, the community memories that we have? Do we value the memories of our forefathers and our ancestors? And who are we? How do we communicate these things? Rituals can all help in making these things happen. So it is perhaps all of these factors that are helping to revive rituals in many societies, and that's for good or for bad. This is especially true in religious matters. We are seeing a growth in ritually oriented communities. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen communities that would never even, Christian communities, for example, that would never even think of going to an Anglican or an Episcopal church, all of a sudden go there and learn their rituals. That's happening in many places in the world. I can't say that's happening for a lot of evangelical churches, but there is a growth of evangelical Anglican or Episcopal churches because people are gravitating more and more to ritual. Bar and Bar Mitzvah is a ritual from the Jewish world. Now, before we go on and talk about some of the rituals that are associated with Bar and Bar Mitzvah, I have an important reminder for us. As we have seen, Bar Bar Mitzvah is not a biblical command. We have to let that sink in for a minute. Despite what Rashi may think, it's not given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Just because a famous rabbi says it doesn't make it true. Do we believe that? We better believe that because that's the truth. We're going to present many traditional Jewish rituals associated with Bar Bar Mitzvah. But since they are not biblical commands, I would like to suggest that we understand that we have freedom. We have freedom by means of the Spirit of God to do or not to do any or all of these rituals, to adhere to them, or not to adhere to them, or to alter them or not to alter them. We have that freedom. It was one of my favorite evangelical teachers of a generation ago was Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer wrote a book called Form and Freedom in the Local Church. I like to transfer that to call it Form and Freedom in the Local Congregation. The point is that the Bible gives form to the congregation. It tells when we are to meet. It tells the holy days we are to celebrate. It tells how to fellowship with each other. It tells us how to build our buildings. It tells us what clothes to wear, and so on and so forth. That's the Torah. It presents the form. But you might notice that there's a lot of freedom. How high are we supposed to build the wall around the roof of our houses? What color are the clothes we're supposed to wear? What about the clothes we attach our fringes to? Can that be colored? Must it be black and white? What about the fringes themselves? How do we tie them? How do we make them? What about the holy days? How do we celebrate Passover? Do we have to use a Haggadah? No. There's freedom in the body of Messiah too. There is freedom. I remember years ago, one of the last times we were in the Philippines actually, a group of leaders gave us a ride from the conference in Baguio City to Manila. And we were traveling together, maybe about 7 of us in the van. And they were sharing with us the fact that they love learning how to do Pesach. They love the fact that they have the freedom now as believers to celebrate Pesach as those grafted into Israel. But then they came out and said, but wait a second, Ariel, they said, the Haggadah is helpful, but there's some stuff that we just can't gravitate toward, like those rabbis getting together at B'nai Barak and the discussion they had. What does that have to do with us? And, I thought about it and I said, yeah, you're right. You don't have to do Pesach in the Jewish way, the Jewish ritual way. You have freedom to do it a Philippine way. It just so happens that right before that van ride home, at this conference, which was many, many years ago, there was a cultural presentation by many, maybe perhaps some of you who were listening, where you, by means of body movement and dance and music and drum beat, you danced out in a ritual way how the good news of Yeshua came to your ancestors, how the story of redemption came to your ancestors. That's a Philippine way of talking about the history of redemption. Pesach is a Jewish way. The Pesach Haggadah is a Jewish way of talking about the history of redemption. I'm sure there are Philippine customs of rites of transition from childhood to adult. Bar mitzvah is a Jewish rite of transition. We have complete freedom to accept it or not to accept it or to adopt our own. If we are going to accept a bar mitzvah as a fun and good ritual to do, what are some rituals associated with this? Oh, there's a few of them. First of all, central to this bar mitzvah ceremony is being called up to read the Torah. The calling up to the reading of the Torah is a symbol of the boy's attaining maturity. In fact, in the Orthodox Jewish world, you don't do it publicly unless there's 10 adult Jewish males present. That's called a minyan. A bar mitzvah now can be called a part of that minyan. If you have only 9 adult Jewish men and you have a bar mitzvah boy, he's counted as part of the minyan. And fundamental to that is getting together to read the Torah. When is he called to do that? He's usually called up on the first occasion that the Torah is read following his 13th birthday, according to the Jewish calendar. Now, this is how the Orthodox Jews do it, and it's pretty much across the board in other denominations. This is the first public demonstration of his new role as a full member of the community, and in modern times, it is to this occasion that the term bar mitzvah usually applies. In the conservative and reformed Jewish circles, this also applies to girls after their 12th birthday, but not in Orthodox circles. The bar mitzvah reads the maftir portion, which is the last calling up of the Torah portion, and he also reads the haftarah on the first Shabbat after his 13th birthday. This requires, of course, preparation and education, because usually, traditionally, the passages are chanted in Hebrew, and they're chanted in Hebrew. Many congregations have Hebrew schools that have special classes for the preparation of bar mitzvah students. Even in Israel, there's special classes. They don't have to learn how to read the Hebrew, but they have to learn how to chant the text. That's part of a modern bar mitzvah ceremony. Needless to say, you don't have to do that. It's nice and beautiful, but it puts a lot of stress upon a non-Hebrew speaking society. Second traditional part of the bar mitzvah ceremony is that the boy puts on tefillin for the first time. Those are the things where your arm is wrapped with a leather box that contains pieces of Torah, and one is put on your forehead with straps on there, and the box contains the same piece of the Torah. That's called tefillin. Tefillin means prayer, and so these are usually worn during prayer times. The major ritual innovation obligatory on a boy reaching bar mitzvah is that henceforth he's required to put on tefillin for the morning prayer. His bar mitzvah is the first time he does it. So oftentimes the bar mitzvah boy is given his first set of tefillin as a bar mitzvah present and taught how to do it. Thirdly, sometimes, in fact a lot of times, the bar mitzvah boy leads congregational prayer. This prayer is from the Siddur, of course, so he has to be schooled in what prayers are said and how to sing some of the prayers. Fourthly, a lot of times after the Torah is read, the rabbi will give a special drash, like a sermon type thing, but a lot of times the bar mitzvah boy is called upon to do the same thing. It could be on the contents of the Torah portion, or what they mean to him personally, or he could talk about what it means for him to be a bar mitzvah, or anything in between. He has to practice ahead of time to give public speeches, and so that's part of his training and what he has to do. So reading Torah, donning tefillin, learning to read the Torah portion in Hebrew and chant it, leading prayers, giving a special drash. And lastly, let's not forget, an important part of this celebration is the party. After the service, After the Torah service, by the way, during the Torah service in a lot of congregations, after the bar mitzvah boys reads their Torah portion, the women of the congregation, sometimes they sit above in a special women's section, or sometimes they are part in a conservative or reformed congregation. There's this part of the congregation. The women get together and they shower the bar mitzvah boy with little pieces of candy. It's just a nice thing to do. But after the service, a very festive kiddush is held in the banquet hall, or maybe on the same or perhaps the following day. A kiddush is where you have a piece of challah, you bless it, you bless the Lord for it, and you have a cup of wine and you thank God for the joy of this occasion. And then you have a great big meal in this, especially for the bar mitzvah celebration, you have a great big meal. Some authorities in the Jewish world rule that a parent must arrange a banquet for their son because bar mitzvah is just as important as a wedding. I wouldn't say to go that far, but it's customary to give the boy a big celebration with food, singing, and dancing, where you put the boy in a chair and lift him up and down, celebrating this wonderful occasion. Apply this to the girl too. It's bar mitzvah, it's the same thing. Among some bar mitzvah, among the celebration, the bar mitzvah boy will deliver his drash during the banquet instead of during the service. Since 1967, some from Israel and also from abroad, outside of Israel, go to the Western Wall for their bar mitzvah celebration. And they make a special pilgrimage to that. It's really fun to be in Jerusalem when that happens, because usually their friends and relatives come and they make a parade through the old city with musical instruments or just a drum and singing, oftentimes with a canopy over the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah girl. It's really a festive occasion. And finally, it's traditional to give gifts, such as money, to the bar mitzvah boy or girl. These are some of the traditional rituals that are done during bar mitzvah. I would like to suggest that do these if you want, if you feel good about it. Remember, none of this is biblical. There's form and there's freedom. I would also like to suggest to innovate on your own. Perhaps have the entire family read the Torah portion, giving each one a separate section for each family member. Or maybe have the parents and or a congregational leader pray for the bar mitzvah boy or girl. Perhaps you just do a Torah reading instead of a whole traditional prayer service. One does not have to read the Torah in Hebrew either. One doesn't have to chant it. Just do what's possible, what feels good to the congregation, what does puts the least amount of pressure to the bar mitzvah boy or girl, but also what challenges them as well. The last section of this presentation I like to label important considerations. There are things to consider and questions for a community to discuss as we talk about bat mitzvah celebrations. We're just going to ask the questions. We're not going to answer them for you. That's your task, to go back to your communities and talk about these things. So in no particular order, here's some important questions that we could be asking. First, what are we attempting to do here? If we're going to have a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, we have to ask ourselves why. Why are we doing this? It is a rite of passage for young people in our community, or isn't it? Is the rite of passage in our community important enough to celebrate it? Remember, the Bible is just silent about the matter. That means that we should not be dogmatic about it, and we should especially not be dogmatic about our tradition. But we do have freedom to celebrate these rites of passage. So we need to be clear and unified on why we are doing a bat mitzvah ceremony, or why we might not be doing one. Second thing to consider, if we are doing one, how do we want to accomplish this rite of passage? Do we want to do it in a bat mitzvah ceremony? Or do we want to do it in a different cultural way? And as we're doing this, if we're doing a bat mitzvah ceremony, we have to ask this: is it our goal to do it in a Jewish way? And if so, what kind of Jewish way? It may surprise some that most religious Jews are not Orthodox. That is, the black coat people or the kippah-wearing people. Most religious Jews are not Orthodox. Most are either Reform, Conservative, or Reconstructionists. If they're going to be religious, that's what they're part of. Most Jews themselves are secular, not religious. So that means that there's a lot of different Jewish customs and traditions. There's no one Jewish way of doing practically anything. Even the teachings of the 5 books of Moses, very seldom is there one definitively Jewish way of doing it. So we have to ask ourselves, which Jewish way do we want to copy? What do we feel good about? What have we learned? Maybe we come from a certain background that we feel good about teaching others. Fine, that's good. We just have to ask the question. And we also, along with this, we have to ask, by what authority do we insist on Orthodox Jewish tradition? In many places, I've seen this in Messianic Judaism, and it's one reason why we've kind of moved away from Messianic Judaism in many ways. Because people put authority onto the Orthodox rabbis. They say that you must do this, that oral Torah did come from Mount Sinai. This is being taught even in Messianic Jewish circles. It's an anathema. It should never be among believers. But it is done. I hope not in your circles. So we have to ask the question, by what authority do we say we must do a bat mitzvah ceremony? And by what authority do we insist that it must be done in an Orthodox Jewish way? Those are serious questions to ask. And we must ask them among our congregants, not just for the congregational leader to answer himself. These are important. Also, if as we're talking about the rite of passage and how we're going to be doing it, can we give ourselves the freedom to be innovative in our attitudes and practices of bar mitzvah? Can we give ourselves the freedom to be innovative? And lastly, as we're considering how we do it, do we treat the girls among us with the same respect, the same love, care, and attention as we do the boys? Why or why not? If we're going to have a bar mitzvah for a boy, what about the girls? Are they not important? Do they not go through the same transition of life? Do they not also love Torah? and tradition? Do we treat the girls the same way as we treat the boys? Why or why not? Another question to answer, a third major question to answer, is this. What does the Bible say on the matter? I kind of talked about this a lot so far, but believe it or not, in many believing circles, especially in the last 20, 30 years, there's a dearth of biblical knowledge. People rely on their congregational leader to teach them. That's good, that's true. He should be doing that. But are they doing that? Or are they quoting a Bible verse and then talking about whatever they want to talk about and say, here's a Bible sermon and it's based on this little portion of this Bible verse and call that Bible teaching? That's what's been going on. Oh, we teach the Bible here, and they recite one verse and just go off on a tangent about whatever happens to be on their mind, some hobby horse that they want to tell their congregation. That's not Bible teaching. Bible teaching is when you get the book out and go verse by verse, passage by passage, without any agenda other than helping people understand what this book says. In that way, and that way alone, people will get to know their Bibles. Because people do not know their Bibles in many believing worlds today, they don't know what it teaches or doesn't teach. Does it teach about bar mitzvah? Oh yeah, our leader said so. No, it doesn't. But how do you know that? How do we know that if we don't know the Bible? It's that simple. We need to truly know the scriptures. All that and only that will give us the discernment to decide what practice, what belief, what tradition is viable for us and must be for us, or what is just human invention. Another question to consider is the fact that in our society, which is based on Judeo-Christian values and truth of liberty, while we forward the intrinsic values of the individual created in the image and likeness of God, should we forget our indigenous tribal heritage of our forefathers? Yes, I've been advocating all along, we have a right to do as we see fit. We have the freedom. We have the form and we have the freedom. But in that freedom, do we push freedom as a God in itself? Do we value truth and liberty, but do we also value what our forefathers have taught us and our tribal heritage from which we have come, which does not contradict the scripture? We have to know what our tribal heritage and how, if it does or does not contradict scripture, that goes without saying it. But if it doesn't contradict scripture and it's a good thing, how much do we value that, to consider that as a form of transition from childhood to adulthood? Next to the last question, I'm almost done here. If we do a bar mitzvah ceremony in our congregation, and we're not Jewish, we could ask, well, if we do it in a Jewish way, are we going to offend the Jewish people? Some say yes, some say maybe, and some say no. I bet you expected that answer, didn't you? But think about this for a moment. First of all, are the Jewish people around us to offend? We may be thinking about a nebulous Jewish person that may be someplace that might come in contact with what we're doing, but might live thousands of miles away from wherever this conference might be. If there's no Jewish people around, don't worry about offending them. Another thing to consider in this, if we do not claim to be Jewish and are not trying to be, there is little offense. A lot of Jewish people would be honored and would love to show you how they do things. If you say, I'm not trying to be Jewish, I'm not Jewish, but I think this Jewish way is a great idea. Can you show me how to do it? Because I think my friends and congregation would love this. They would be terribly honored to teach you. And this would apply to bar mitzvah. And lastly in this, make up your own Jewish tradition. Your Messianic Jewish congregations. There's no one Messianic Jewish way of doing this either. There's a lot of Messianic Jewish traditions. Just like there's a lot of Baptists in the Christian world, there's a lot of Jewish believing traditions as well. the UMJC does it one way, the MJA does it another way. Who knows? There's a lot of Messianic Jewish circles, and there's no one Messianic Jewish way of doing it. So that means you can make up your own traditions and do it your way in your congregation. Lastly, I'll leave you with this question. Can we live with it? If we do a bar mitzvah ceremony in the way in which we're doing it, can we, as a congregation, as friends and families, live with the way we're doing it? If we like it, do it. Is it helpful? Do it. If it agrees with Scripture, do it. If not on all occasions, then don't do it. It's that simple. I hope you do bar mitzvah. I think it's a very, very helpful rite of passage. But I hope as we plan it for our congregations, we keep it in mind that it is a human tradition and it doesn't go back in Judaism a whole lot and very often, and that we have a right to decide our own philosophy of life as believers in Yeshua who follow Torah. So I'll leave that with you, my friends, and it was a privilege and honor for me to share these thoughts with you. Pray